Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Moises Maldonado, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator for this session. So today we will explore a very interesting topic, promoting refugees protection through behavioral science. And we will be diving into the key theme on how can we harness behavioral science to promote refugee protection and challenge harmful narratives. And well, this session is brought to you by Innovation Service, which works to foster new creative and inclusive approaches to humanitarian challenges. And the key objective of the service is to support teams in developing and testing innovative solutions that can make a real world difference. So the three projects that you will see today are fantastic examples of the work that's this work in action, and they have been supported by the Innovation Service, and we're proud to have them presented here. So our format for this session will be a TED-style presentation. So each of our participants and I will introduce them one by one. You will have each of them talking 5 minutes, followed by a simple question. And at the end of the presentation, no worries, we will have some time for you to have a Q&A. So you will be able to ask our wonderful speakers about their topics, more on their topics. So let me start with the agenda that we have. So we have 3 topics. One is Journey to Inclusion, which is enhancing services access for refugees and migrants in Poland. The second talk will be about strengthening information integrity in humanitarian settings. And the last one will be Beyond Full-Time, changing the narrative around displacement through football. So before we start, I will ask our presenters, please put your names and share with our colleagues like Colette, where you work and what's your topic. So our first session is Journey to Inclusion, Enhancing Services Access to Refugees, Migrants in Poland. And I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Alexandra Samonet, Ola, works in the UNHCR Poland operation, where she implements projects related to innovation, behavioral science, and empowerment of community-based organizations. So she's joined also by George Ailiotis, who works in the Livelihoods and Economic Inclusion team, as well in UNHCR Poland. And he focused on aligning economic inclusion with initiatives in protections principles. So I now invite them to present. And George, you have the floor to start us off. Over to you, George.
Thank you, Moses. And hello, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to present the social behavior change communication strategy in Poland. Poland currently hosts close to 1 million Ukrainian refugees, the majority of which female, with around 40% of the refugee population being women of working age. While many are aware of available services like employment support, housing programs, or language classes, a large number, especially female-headed households and collective shelter residents, are not accessing them. Our strategy was designed to bridge the gap between knowing what's available and actually taking action. We are targeting 3 key behaviors that mark real steps towards independence: accessing formal employment, moving into independent housing, and reaching basic fluency in Polish. Our primary audiences are women from female-headed households, residents of collective shelters, and we also focus on the host community, especially landlords and employers, because their openness can either create opportunity or reinforce exclusion. I should note here that during the co-design process of the strategy, partners, mainly civil society organizations, received meta-supported training through UNHCR to implement the strategy on their own, ensuring this way long-term sustainability of the strategy. Now, moving on to the barriers. The strategy focused on barriers that communication can realistically influence, like mindset, motivation, and trust, while acknowledging deeper systemic issues. It was co-designed with community input, validated through working groups, and tested narratives. We used the behavioral drivers model to identify what's really holding people back. The BDM recognizes that human behavior is complex and influenced by multiple interacting factors. It moves beyond the idea that simply providing information leads to behavior change. The model organizes behavior drivers into three broad categories. The psychological barriers that we identified include learned helplessness, fixed mindsets, and low self-confidence. Sociological barriers such as peer discouragement and cultural friction also emerged. In addition, we observed environmental barriers, which include gaps in access, misinformation, and isolation. Now, moving on to the core message of the communication campaign. The strategy proposes this message as a simple and resonant message which is inspired by a well-known Ukrainian phrase, live here and now. This message encourages people to take one step at a time, to focus on today rather than be overwhelmed by everything that they've lost and they have to rebuild. The campaign aims to bring this message to life through stories from fellow refugees who faced and overcome similar challenges, and Polish voices, including landlords and employers, who are modeling inclusive practices. The messages are designed to reassure refugees that fear and uncertainty are normal, to offer practical guidance on how to move forward, and to demonstrate that progress, even small progress, is possible. Now, there's a multi-channel approach proposed by the strategy with trusted community-based platforms at the center of the campaign. These include digital platforms, offline touchpoints, and influencers. Furthermore, a number of tailored flagship activities that turn the strategy into lived experience are proposed also within the strategy, from language learning to storytelling circles, mobile theater, peer mentorship, and public art. These initiatives that are proposed in our strategy aim to foster connection, confidence, and a sense of shared belonging. To date, more than 40 organizations in Poland have expressed interest in supporting the implementation of our strategy. A full cycle of technical working groups involving key stakeholders, including government actors, has been completed, and over 15 orientation sessions have been held for implementing partners. We are excited to share that the full strategy will be available soon, and we look forward to discussing its components and rollout plans in more detail soon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, George. Thank you for your insightful presentation. It's fascinating to see that this strategy directly targets psychological and sociological barriers, and the collaborative model that you presented with over 40 plus organizations and governments is a powerful approach. So this leads to my question. So I would like to be here, Ola, for this question. So what does it mean to apply behavioral science in support of UNHCR broad protection mandate, and how these approaches help address this diverse challenge faced across the protection spectrum? Thanks.
Thank you so much for this question, extremely important one. Since behavioral science amplifies protection efforts of UNHCR, it helps us build strategies that are not just rights-based, but also realistic, human-centered, psychologically attuned to people we serve in different contexts. Applying behavioral science means recognizing that human behavior is shaped not just by information and rights, but also by emotions, context, social norms, perceived control of the situation. This approach adds depth to protection programming by helping us understand why people do or do not act, even when the services exist or rights are guaranteed, but also in contexts where they are not. In the context of our protection work, this means several things. First, moving beyond awareness campaigns, and two, strategies that shift mindsets, build confidence, and reduce fear in people. Second, designing interventions that consider the real-life constraints that people are facing, not just what they should do, but what they can realistically do. Another important element is engaging both refugees and host communities to share more inclusive behavior and attitudes on both sides, and using behavioral approaches to understand not only what people say they need, but how they make decisions, what motivates or discourages their action. This helps uncover hidden barriers and opportunities that traditional methods may just miss. Also important is going beyond listing needs to exploring behavioral drivers. This includes trust in institutions, fear of stigma, previous experiences in life that influence whether people seek support, follow through, or disclose their needs to us. And lastly, designing services that are intuitive, low friction, emotionally resonant. This includes simplifying access points, building trust through user-centered communication, addressing behavioral bottlenecks like procrastination, shame, or information overload as well. So by integrating these behavioral science approaches across different dimensions, we can move from simply providing services to ensuring people can and will use them. Ultimately, this strengthens the impact, relevance, and sustainability of our protection efforts at UNHCR.
Thank you, Alexandra and George, for that insightful presentation and the answer. Now, we will now transition to our next speaker. Our next presentation is Strengthening Information Integrity in Humanitarian Settings. And for this, I'm happy to introduce Katie Drew. Katie supports UNHCR Digital Protection Workstream, and with a focus on information integrity on digital platforms. So Katie, please begin your presentation.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Ola. Thanks George as well for the great presentation preceding. And so just to sort of build on a little bit more around sort of UNHCR's approach to adopting behavior science, I'm specifically going to be outlining pre-bunking, an approach that we have applied in South Africa to address anti-foreigner sentiment. And just very quick on the background for South Africa, there is a proliferation online in terms of, hateful content, anti-refugee, anti-migrant content that has actually bubbled over into sort of real life harms and real life violence against non-South Africans in South Africa. And so for UNHCR, this is clearly a protection concern and definitely something we wanted to address. So we can start with the first slide of the presentation, please. I'm just going to quickly outline what is pre-bunking. And down at the bottom, you'll see a big logo from Jigsaw. So this is an entity in Google that had developed quite a lot on pre-bunking, and the approach is built heavily on 1970s, 80s, and 1990s theory and academic research, looking at how we can actually build a resilience to misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech online. And so pre-bunking is a tried and tested communication technique. It hasn't necessarily been tried and tested so much in forced displacement contexts, nor in low resource settings. So that's something that we really wanted to see whether it was applicable. And the purpose is to build mental antibodies. And so they often use analogies related to sort of vaccination. So you're inoculated, you have a natural defense to be able to sort of go into the online space and identify misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And it's broken down into sort of 3 key steps that we see. So the first thing that you'll see with this approach is an emotional warning. And from a psychological perspective, this emotional warning is actually really important. No matter what language you're listening to, if someone says, hey, heads up, warning, watch out, alert, we are more likely as humans to then listen to the next piece of information because we have a natural instinct to protect ourselves. Then what happens is in the second step of the pre-bunking approach, you get a microdose. So you get sort of like with a vaccine, you get introduced to what misinformation or disinformation or hate speech might look like. Out of context, you understand that it's being sort of analyzed within this sort of approach. And then finally, you get a refutation. So you get sort of an exposure to why this information is not true, and then what is the sort of truthful information that you should be taking away from this. And so we have tried this approach in South Africa, and I'll just explain a little bit what we did. So we wanted to test the approach. We tried some digital variations of it because this is primarily where we've seen sort of a lot of the work historically as being sort of gamified approaches, looking at videos. It really wasn't suitable for the South Africa context because we were working in schools. Not every school had electricity, connectivity, and even though maybe students were interacting with the digital space, you know, in non-school settings, in their school settings, we couldn't do something that was going to be digital. So we wanted a low cost to no cost analog solution. We realized as well when we're talking about sort of pre-bunking and that warning piece when it comes to South Africa, if we do it in isolation, hey, warning, people might be saying something around refugees and migrants online, there's a natural resistance to it because these are deep-rooted and embedded beliefs. It's a divided society with a great history of division, of course. And so this is something that we really needed to think about. How can we wrap pre-bunking into a more packaged conversation when we're talking about inclusion and the spirit of Ubuntu? I am who I am because of who we are. And what we realized through this process is the testing and the iteration has been absolutely critical. And so we've developed a board game, an offline board game. Seems very simplistic, but as you play the board game, you're walking in the path of a number of different people who live in the South African context. You might be someone who's traveled from the rural centre to the urban centre. You might be someone who's fled persecution from DRC, or you might be someone whose family has moved from Zimbabwe for economic reasons. And as you play the game, you get exposed to pre-bunking, which you can see there as a message. You've got tricked by a fake WhatsApp message saying foreigners are spreading diseases. Then you get the sort of the refutation, and then you get the result of your action is that you have to go back one square. This is all wrapped into a sort of broader facilitation process. And I know I'm running out of time, so I just want to quickly explain some of the very, very early testing results that we've seen. So we're going to move to the next slide, if possible. It's not moving on my side. I wonder whether... Can everyone else see that it's moved? There we go. That's great. So this is just some early testing results. We've tested 3 provinces in South Africa with youth from about 14 to 17 years old. And what we've really seen is early indications that this can have an impact, both on perceptions towards, refugees and migrants, which is definitely what we want to see from a refugee protection perspective. But also people are more likely to identify that there are people online who are wanting to emotionally manipulate them. And so this will have a resulting impact on people's ability to better navigate online spaces, identify misinformation, identify when maybe they're being sort of manipulated and these tactics are being used more broadly, not just related to refugee protection. Some of the things that we really need to test is how long does this outcome last? This was based on pre and post testing when it comes to gameplay. Obviously, that doesn't mean that you're going to then take those attitudes and change your behaviors in the online and offline space. That's definitely something that we want to have a look at. And then also research, academic research into pre-bunking indicates that booster shots, just like a vaccine, if you get a booster shot, you actually strengthen your immunity. So what can we do to really try and reinforce this, the natural antibodies that people have when it comes to digital resilience? And so, yeah, in a nutshell, that's our approach in South Africa. We're really keen to see if and how we can scale this to different contexts as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Katie, for that compelling look at pre-bunking, this concept of building mental antibodies against misinformation. I'm sure it's a game changer. So it's incredible to see how it can have a huge impact on xenophobic attitudes. So This, given that this project was developed with partners, so I would like this to lead me to my question for you. So, what is the importance of partnerships in advancing behavioral science, and how does engaging with diverse range of partners, particularly within the more complex structures of UNHCR, shape your work?
I'll go back to Ola's answer for this, because Ola's answer is completely why we need partners. So when she was talking about, we need to understand the fear, the trust, the barriers, the context, UNHCR can't do that by ourselves. We definitely need to work with community-based partners. We definitely need to work with refugee-led organizations, civil society. A key part of our process when it comes to information integrity is to actually engage with a new sort of group of partners to UNHCR, which is digital rights groups as well, who understand sort of how people are operating in and experiencing the online space from a human rights and digital rights perspective. And I think that that's also really critical. We found as well, when we're sort of taking this approach, and I referred a couple of times to academia and sort of academic research, is that there is a lot of work that has been done in terms of what makes these approaches the most effective, and how can we really apply those approaches in humanitarian context. So we need to draw heavily on academia as well. And then finally, the private sector. I mean, the private sector have been quite instrumental for us in South Africa. We've worked closely with Jigsaw, who have really, Jigsaw Google, who have really tried and tested this across a number of contexts, including anti-refugee sentiment in Europe, for example. And so their training and their expertise, we were able to sort of really try and bring together stakeholders. They provided a direct training to refugee-led organizations and civil society, so that we are all talking the same talk when it comes to the approach that we want to adopt, and that we all are sort of working from a level playing field when we understand sort of the comparative advantages that we have when it comes to the sort of knowledge base, be that an academic perspective or be that a deeply rooted sort of community perspective as well. So I mean, Ola answered my question. She said the what, and I think the partnerships is the how. So yeah.
Thank you, Kaylee, for this response and explanation. And now we will move to our final talk. Our final presentation is titled Beyond Full-Time, Changing the Narrative around Displacement Through Football. So I would like to introduce Colette Armitage. Colette supports the UNHCR Sports Coordination Team, working with sports partners to improve the lives of displaced people and host communities globally. So she leads Beyond Full-Time project, which is supported also by Innovation Service. But with this introduction, Colette, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Moses. And hi, colleagues. Great to be on the call with you today. You did such a great introduction that I no longer need to say anything about myself, so that's good. I put my LinkedIn here, shameless plug perhaps, but no, if we want to keep the conversation going afterwards, I found it a great platform to keep the conversation going, as I'm meant to only present for 5 minutes. So indeed, I led on the Beyond Full-Time project. I'm going to just caveat this talk by saying I'm not a be.sci expert, but I saw an opportunity and really wanted to learn more about how be.sci, behavioral science and its methodology could promote positive narratives around refugees. And being in the sports team, I thought that sport was the ideal platform to do that through. So this is a work in progress, this project, and I'm going to present to you where we've got to so far. But before doing that, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. When I say football fan, what comes to mind? I think for many people, this is what comes to mind. Very extreme, violent, aggressive, maybe the word hooligan, and maybe the word racist as well. So someone who's not very considerate when it comes to refugee issues, or perhaps the social cause in general. Or perhaps it's this. A family who are a fan of a local team or a bigger team. They like going to the matches at the weekend or not every weekend, and they like playing it together as well. Or is it something like this, where football is the backbone of a community and can really be a force for good and for social change, where refugees can be welcomed through football and it can help to mobilize a movement around refugee protection? Regardless of what you think about football fans, and I'm sure there'll be different views about this, there are lots of them. There are 3 billion fans worldwide. And if you're thinking about kind of the big football matches like the World Cups, on average, there are about 175 million spectators. So as a platform to engage new audiences, it has huge potential for UNHCR and has huge potential for the UN more globally as well. So that's exactly what I set out to do and be on full time with the team of colleagues at UNHCR. We wanted to know whether football fans could be engaged around refugee issues, and if so, how should we do that in the most impactful way? What makes them tick? What are their interests? What are their values? And what are their attitudes towards refugees? We did this in 3 case study countries, Germany, the UK, and Spain. And we took a multi-method approach using a light touch quantitative survey. This gave us some segmentation figures about the numbers of football fans and their level of fandom / their level of sentiment towards refugees. And then the tasty bit, as I like to describe it, was really the focus group discussions, where we sat them down and asked them questions about their attitudes towards refugees and how they interact with football. What does it mean to them? And as I'll go on to describe, there are many synergies and linkages with sentiments towards football and also the idea of solidarity towards refugees. We were particularly interested in the movable middle and inactive supporter. These are segmentations of the population that Ipsos, our research partner, have developed. The idea being that the movable middle are sitting on the fence. They have some values that indicate that they are, possibly could support refugees, but at the moment they're not doing so. They have the biggest impact for UNHCR. If we can reach them, we can really create a whole new advocacy base in support of refugees. And then the inactive supporters, these guys and girls are football fans that their values completely align with supporting refugees, but at the moment they're not supporting UNHCR or supporting refugees actively. So what did we find out from the study? Well, we found out that young men between the ages of 18 to 34 should be our target. And surprisingly, it's the hardcore fans that we should be targeting. And this challenged our original hypothesis. We thought that hardcore fans would be the most difficult to reach with communications around refugee issues, but in fact, they seem to be more positive or neutral towards refugee issues. We also found that an emotional connection between fans and refugees already exists. And, this was very reaffirming for me. I saw that fans actually do understand refugee issues and they do want to support refugees more globally. They understand the barriers that they face and the challenges they face when integrating into new communities. However, fans are unsure of their role and they don't know what they can do to help. So any campaigns that we create should focus on building hope, resilience, and clear ways for fans to make a difference. Our key interlocutors are clubs and players. If the clubs and players do it, the fans will follow. This was a key message that came out of the research. However, we need to bear in mind that authenticity is key. The ultimate thing we're all aiming for here is going local, being local, but going global. The research really identified that local fan-led initiatives can have big impact. Even on a small scale, we can have big, large-scale impact just from a few small local initiatives. We need to reframe the narrative. We need to shift the narrative from seeing refugees as burdens and seeing them as contributors to society. And we need to be very strategic in our platforms and how we communicate to football fans. We need to break out of the echo chambers and work with clubs and players to find platforms where we can reach football fans with our content. The conclusion? Well, of course, I believe that football is a global platform for social change and that football fans are an untapped potential. They can be change makers, whether it be for refugee issues or any of your social issues that you're working on. I really believe that they can be this force for good. So going back to that first slide, we had 3 pictures. I challenge you to think of football fans in this way: a force for good, a group of the population that are huge and offer huge potential for us in the UN system and further afield to reach new audiences and to bridge across the divide on the topics that we're working on. So the next step for us is to build those strategies in a local context and to do some testing around this and to gather more data on the potential of football fans to support refugees. Thanks.
Thank you, Colette. Inspiring to see how your project Beyond Full-Time use the football platform for social change, and this evidence-based approach that you use to identify allies, let's say, on top change makers, and to break these echo chambers. It's a fantastic example of how to find in new allies. Which brings me to my question for you. Is why is it crucial to understand diversity of audiences, and how does behavioral science help ensure that interventions truly reflect how people think, feel, and of course behave?
Yeah, thanks, Moises. I mean, all these questions are sort of interlinked, right? For me, the biggest opportunity when we get to reach new and diverse audiences is that for us in the UN system, it gives us a chance, a platform to reach new people that we wouldn't normally talk to and try to break down a little bit this toxic, polarized online environment that we seem to be stuck in our modern society. And, we're seeing the results of this online toxicity in everyday life now. And even though we have this great online platform where we can potentially reach millions of people, we end up talking to the same people. We're preaching to the choir. And so we're not able to shift narratives in positive ways. So for me, this is the great benefit of football, but it could be any sport, but football, I guess, is the world's game. It has the biggest online platform. And I also think for UNHCR, thinking about the enabling environment in which refugees live in it's not necessarily a creative approach, but it's an approach to protection that we need to integrate within our work as much as possible. Because if we can create those enabling environments in which refugees are living in, their chance of being included, their chance of thriving and having opportunities for their future well-being are much more likely to succeed. And these sorts of interventions where we're working with the host community to build those enabling environments can go hand in hand with operational protection work that we do, working directly with refugees. But if it's only ever limited to working directly with refugees, then the long-standing impact will be greatly reduced. So I think that's key for looking at diverse audiences. And why behavioral science? Well, I think it's already been said, it's really about understanding the psyche of these new audiences that we at UNHCR really don't get an opportunity to talk to very often. Taking part in the focus group discussions, it was fascinating to see what football fans thought of UNHCR, thought of refugees, thought of our work. And that's insight that we could never glean otherwise unless we took an approach like this that really wants to understand behaviors and build an approach that's going to have the biggest impact. It's needs-based, it's localized, and it's culturally sensitive as well.
Thank you, Colette. Thank you. And now we are running out of time, and I would like to have some time for the open Q&A with the audience. So to kick us, perhaps I will pose one more question, this one for Ola and George. And so then we open the floor for the audience. So how do you get this cross-organizational buy-in on support of your behavioral science work from your experience? So what challenge do you face, or how do you resolve them on the field? Over to you. Yeah.
Perhaps I can respond, George, unless you would like to take the question. Thank you. This is a very important practical question. We have collaborated with other agencies, most notably UNICEF colleagues here in Poland, who have for the social behavior change project, they actually have their own unit and task force that deals exclusively with social behavior change. So we did reach out to them, and we ended up having a very good and close collaboration. I think partly it had to do with trust building, explaining in detail what motivates us to take up the project as UNHCR and what added benefit it will have to the operations and the mandate of both agencies. So we have tried to extrapolate that to other partners, NGOs, and the government. And we have started that well before the strategy was taking place. So an important component for us was that the strategy is co-designed. It is led by multiple agencies, not in the sense that they are contributing their inputs or coming up with opinions, but that at this stage of ideation, of thinking about how the strategy can serve the refugees, we take all these perspectives, all these valid perspectives from different agencies who deal with different groups, and we start with that. So we not only involve them after the project has been written down, but we took their opinion very early on. And I think this is what made this collaboration successful. So we will try to carry it over to all the projects that we are implementing with other agencies, other mandates in the future.
And if I may add, thank you, Ola, specifically about government actors that we want and need their buy-in, and which may at times be a little bit more hesitant than civil society organizations. Very essential, we have found it is to prove the usefulness of any potential new initiative or idea, and specifically about social behavioral change science, which may be something new for many, for civil servants, at least that we are directly in contact with in order to collaborate on this topic. Is for us also very important to find in what activities, initiative, or programs that the government is already implementing we can link our efforts on social behavioral change and how this can actually be utilized by the government to benefit them as well. For one short example, and I'm finishing, is there is already an existing access to independent housing program in Poland, and there is limited participation or interest from refugees. One way we went about it was to convince government counterparts that by utilizing this strategy, you can actually get increased interest from the refugee community to utilize your programs and therefore be able to absorb even more funding, because this was an EU-funded project. And this was one of the arguments, for example, that ensured that the government was on board with this specific project. Thanks.
Thanks, George. Thanks. So before we thank you for this response, and before we open the floor for the audience, well, now let's start opening the floor. Why don't we start with the question that we have in the chat? If you want to take, Katie, these questions. This question from Michelle Mills. If you want to explain further about these questions, I think it's interesting. Oh, yeah, we have this one in the chat.
Yeah, happy to. I think it is really interesting. And one of the things that we were looking at is that we wanted to work initially with a sort of 13 plus age group, because those are the age groups that are sort of allowed according to sort of the restrictions of different platform providers to be using, let's say TikTok, WhatsApp, you name it, you need to have a sort of minimum age limit. But actually what we're thinking as well is, if we are really focusing on sort of pre-bunking, is there a way that we could actually work with younger audiences to sort of prepare them and make sure that they are digitally resilient citizens from a much earlier age? And we also know that, people are maybe interacting with platforms that their sisters and their brothers are on, or they maybe are actually exposed to misinformation and disinformation and hate speech, potentially through gaming platforms or, different fora. So this is definitely something that we wanted to have a look at, but we really need to think about, and going back to Ola's response, like, how are we actually going to engage with this age group? How are we going to build trust? How are we going to get the confidence to be able to sort of have these discussions that really are potentially bringing conversations that are very different to maybe the conversations that they're having at home around sort of, issues related to xenophobia? And I think that that's where we have to try and identify who would be the partners to do this with. I mean, I put in there, like, do we need Sesame Street to help us with pre-bunking? But that's also, do we need Sesame Street to help us with pre-bunking? Because is it a channel that is useful, or should we be maybe picking up with some of the gaming platforms like Roblox, etc., to think about ways of meeting the audience? Yeah.
Thanks, Katie. So now over to the audience. The floor is for the audience. Please unmute yourself. Don't be shy. Ask questions. We have some time for receiving your questions. Questions? You can also, if you want, if you don't like to unmute yourself. Okay, we have one question. Alpha, yeah, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Yeah.
All right. First off, thank you very much for this presentation. They were short and sweet, which I love, and they were concrete, most importantly. So I just have a few questions. Number one, how do we frame, because when we say behavioral science, it can be a bit like the concept can be a bit, like high level. How can we, like, if we discuss with refugees, let's say in camps, in a setting which is like a non-scientific setting, like non-theoretical setting, how can we frame behavioral science so that people understand? Like personally, I like to use the word influencing. Like we have all these social media influencers, so when I talk with, refugees, I like to use the term like we're ethical influencers. Like, can we, like, what other terms do you think we can use, like when we have like layman discussions with colleagues and, with partners, when we want to start a project? The second question is, like, can you walk through the experience of labeling a project a behavioral science project? Like what the three presentations we had so far, like how do you get there? Like what drives you to that moment where like, oh, this project would be good, using this methodology? This is the second thing. And then my third question, how do you engage? Can you give us like some tips? And I love the presentation on sports, by the way, because in refugee camps, sports is like a common denominator across ethnicities, across, like, this is something that brings people together. Like during the Champions League, like we had so many conflict that we avoided and so many conflict that were added because of the, because of all these classical tensions. So how do you have a conversation with different people, basically refugees, partners, and like what resources would you suggest basically to come to, to start a project to influence social and behavioral change? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alpha. Anyone from the speakers who would like to take Alpha's, yeah?
I could answer on the how did I get to the point of be.sci going there, but I'd let Ulla and Katie speak perhaps more to how do we communicate what this is with refugee populations, because that's been a big focus of their work. It's a really, really good question. To be honest, I had read and heard a lot about how the elections around the world have been swayed towards right-wing candidates because they're very effective at the way that they communicate, gather data, and pitch their advocacy campaigns towards certain segments of the population. Sometimes using unethical approaches to gather data on people, of course. But I thought, well, if they're doing it for what I would say is, that's digressing social good in my eyes, then why don't we use it in our platform to make social good? There seems to be an opportunity here where we can make more peaceful communities, we can make more inclusive communities, which for me seems like a great opportunity. And so I have this idea about sport. I work in sport. I see the platform. You're quite right. It's not always positive. It can create some challenges as well. And I was just thinking to myself, well, there seems to be an opportunity here, but I'm not quite sure. I think we can change narratives. I think we can shift behaviors, but I'm not quite sure what the tool is to use. And when I described this to the innovation service at UNHCR, they said, oh, well, have you heard of this methodology, behavioral science? And coming from a social science background, I kind of had, but I hadn't put two and two together. And it was really having sort of, the innovation service there to help bounce ideas back and forth that helped to build it as a behavioural science project. And then I got exposed to the UN behavioural science team and community that exists. And then also working with Ipsos as a research partner, again, helped to build my understanding about what it includes to be a be.sci project. And it is really multidisciplinary. So many of the things you see in a be.sci project, you see in other types of research. For example, market research is very similar, but the be.sci element goes a little bit beyond and thinks about sort of how do we shift behaviors over the long term, thinking about cultural influences, also individual influences, communities, families, friends, etc. So it takes it as a more holistic view. And that's how I would describe it anyway. But over to Katie, Ula, or George who want to complement what I've said.
Thanks. So I might just jump in terms of how to explain the approach. And I am by no means an academic or expert in behaviour science, but the way I remember it being explained to me when I was at university many moons ago was that it's actually taking a very sort of humanistic approach. And so what you're actually looking at is really trying to listen first and understand why people are acting how they're acting. And so the way that this was explained to me was, imagine you've got someone, a cranky auntie in your family that you don't really understand. Rather than just labeling her as the cranky auntie in your family, you really want to understand what's making her upset, why is she always tired, and these kind of things. And so you're asking the why questions, and the why questions. And so when you're working at the community level, it's just to really encourage people to sort of dig beneath the surface in terms of what they see as a behavior, to try and understand what is driving those behaviors and what is making different people within the communities sort of act. And I think for UNHCR, many organizations are the same, that we have many approaches that we've already started to, we're definitely sort of introducing in communities to try and understand a little bit more, particularly when we look at age, gender, and diversity, and trying to think about, we don't just think of the community as one whole. We're trying to sort of think about, to Colette's point, different segments of the community, different audiences, different approaches, and different sort of needs, wants, and capabilities, and really trying to take that sort of diverse lens to understand a lot more. So I think, Alpha, when you're sort of working in communities, is just to encourage people to keep asking those why questions, why, and to think about, it's a mix of different individuals rather than a mass that is, can be represented with one voice and one approach. Yeah.
If I may, just to add to what Katie
Go
said
ahead.
About encouraging communities, I think one important element, and also Alpha, you mentioned that the role of influencers and specifically those among the influencers who become thought leaders is important primarily not because of the arguments that they are sharing, because research tells us in a solid list of studies that people do not listen to arguments. People listen to their experience and they tune into the relationships that they are able to form with others within the community. Some influencers, some thought leaders among the influencers, they are able to form these relationships that are in the sense parasocial, but they are the relationships that people have subscribed to. They are already open to listening in this relationship. And so exploring these different channels of communication with people can ensure that we not only put forward solid arguments, but we do it in an environment that makes people more receptive to actually being open to hearing them. So this is why these digital relationships are so important, because among different actors in the digital space, influencers have this capacity to have a relationship. Of course, it is not a normal social relationship, but a parasocial one, but one where they can communicate certain things and make certain attitudes, for example, their lifestyle or their refugee status or their vulnerability status, overt to people and spur acceptance in society. So I think these are also very important. And this important element that I would always stress, both in relationship with partners and partners working with refugee communities and other communities of the people we serve, is forming relationships in a sense that is tangible and that provides people with lived experience of how things can be good involving the refugees. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you. We have another question from Tania Eva, and I think it's for Colette. Why this group of football fans were chosen as a core audience? You want to respond this one, Colette?
Yes. And I see in the chat, Michelle.
And
yes.
And we have another one. Do you want to take both in your same
yes.
answer? Yeah. Thanks.
Why this group of football fans? I mean, do you mean in terms of location or in terms of the movable middle / inactive supporter? The locations were chosen because we wanted to run it in line with the Euros 2024 that took place last year. We saw this as like a big mega football event where people get really engaged around the subject of football, regardless of whether you're a hardcore supporter of your club that you go see every weekend, or you're a bit like me, I admit, that likes to support England every once in a while when they get to the final but never quite win. So that's why we chose these countries, and also they're important for UNHCR. We have good, strong country officers and national partners that work there too. The movable middle are the ones that are most interesting for UNHCR and for me. They're the ones that don't currently support us. But if they did, they're a huge segment of the population, and they could really help to shift the needle, shift the dialogue and narrative around displacement in the positive. And they could become a new base of advocates for UNHCR, whether that means supporting refugees through their own actions and refugee organizations, or supporting UNHCR and its work. So that's really why we looked at movable middle. And then the inactive supporters are sort of the low-hanging fruit. They already support us with their beliefs and their values, so they're easier to reach and to engage, but they're not currently doing so. So maybe it's just smaller interventions, easier interventions would reach them. And then for Michelle's question, beyond digital approaches, are you considering other practical actions to effectively reach and engage the target fan group? I was also surprised that it was the hardcore fans. Right. I mean, I could ask you, Michelle, what your hypothesis is, why you think it's the hardcore fans that have positive and neutral views. Maybe you could type your answer in the chat. But yes, we're definitely, we want to combine a communications advocacy-based approach with something that's rooted in local action. And I think that's the only way to have such an impactful approach that will last in the long term. So what we're looking to do now is to work in a country context, work with the country office to build a campaign, a strategy that would reach football fans on the online sphere, and then also reach football fans through practical engagements. And this was something that the research also identified, was fans need to have clear pathways for engagement, whether that volunteering with refugees, whether that's improving livelihood opportunities for refugees through football, giving them more space in the stadium through community groups or tickets to see events. So, the research really looked at that practical, local level initiatives, and also the bigger campaign advocacy strategy that needs to accompany it.
Thanks, Colette. We are approaching the end of the session. Perhaps we have more time for another question from the audience before we go to the conclusion. If not, I can. Not from there. Okay, so I will. I have one question. Perhaps I will ping Katie on this one, and it's more on the misinformation. Okay, so how do you navigate this ethical line between correcting harmful narratives and being, let's say, managing the information space, particularly in sensitive humanitarian contexts?
Thanks. And we've discussed this quite a lot as well. We had a big workshop with 100 stakeholders from civil society, refugee, host community, government, private sector. And we were discussing, particularly when you go and look at that sort of 3-step approach when it comes to pre-bunking, the micro dose. How do you micro dose without actually then just putting information like a stereotype that actually just gets picked up and taken out into the environment? And actually what works quite well, and this is, you know, has to be contextualized and didn't work in another context, which I know that a partner of ours found out, but what works quite well in South Africa is humor and gags and skits and sort of overemphasizing a stereotype in order to make sort of something, you know, sort of quite comical out of it, rather than it becoming something that's like sort of damaging and harmful. But the ethical line isn't for UNHCR to decide. Again, it goes back to that sort of multi-stakeholder partner approach and like looking at how are we really identifying and testing what is acceptable, what is you know, communicated and what can be you know, what can be accepted and tested. So we tested and tested and tested again, small scale, controlled, with control, you know, with small groups, etc. Another thing that we've been working a lot with is the private sector, who've been telling us again how their sort of their policies and their sort of community guidelines have been developed over time, and the language that's being sort of moderated is based in context, and people constantly sort of saying these are the terminologies, this is what we don't like to see, this is the images that we don't like to see, and very contextual coding that we're starting to learn as we're developing the project. Yeah.
Thanks, Katie. And perhaps we have one minute more for our colleagues on Poland for one last question. So in terms of scalability of the methodology, so if some other operations or agencies wants to replicate your methodology, how potentially scalable is your methodology? Over to you in just 1-2 minutes. Thank you.
Perhaps I start and George can add if needed. We are following tried and tested steps, ones that already have been implemented previously in Brazil. And we are also trying to build capacity of the local actors, including the government counterparts who are interested in using these kind of interventions in their own activities. In Poland, there is a government-led project of establishing foreigner integration centers all over the country. And the government actually is interested in mainstreaming this kind of approach in their interventions throughout the country. So we are working with UNICEF, also with other colleagues, to make this methodology available to partners locally. And I am sure that in case any of the colleagues here are interested in developing these kind of interventions, we have been trained and certified as trainers for social behavior change interventions in the humanitarian space. And it doesn't take a lot to get your team on board, establish solid steps for this methodology. It's also, depending on the context and the scale of the project, not very costly to start. So of course, the implementation of the interventions depends on the choice that you may have, but you have a lot of flexibility in terms of budget, in terms of staff that you are going to involve, in terms of the scope of the project. So we really encourage everybody to try. And in case they need any kind of push, any further information, we are happy to provide it.
Thanks, Ola, and thanks. This is all the time we have for questions, and I want to sincerely thank you, all the speakers, Ola, George, Katie, Colette, and also Raj for the organization, and all of the audience for the participation and the questions. I would like to ask our speakers to drop their contacts there. If we have some colleagues interested on learning more about your projects, I would like to ask you to drop your contacts over there. And we encourage all you to stay connected. We have another conversation with Hovik tomorrow. It's about also behavioral science with UN agency leaders, and they will explore the role of innovation in the wider UN system with this approach to behavioral science. So thank you so much and have a nice day.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
you.